Hi, everyone. Hopefully, you all are having a great day at Day of Shecurity. We're super excited to be presenting this year, also because it's, both of ours first time presenting at a conference. My name is Shefali Shah, and I work for Tinder as a security GRC manager. And today I'm going to tag team with Palak Pahwa, my co-presenter, also works at Tinder as a GRC security engineer too, and we are going to walk you through the ISO 27001 framework. So by doing so, we really wanted to simplify the standard for all of you. Some may be new to the entire cybersecurity field. So we wanted to delve deeper, and our agenda today is what is the standard itself, what is an ISMS, and more specifically, what is an ISO 27001 ISMS. Then we will go on to talk about what is ISO 27002 and how does it relate to the standard. Why do we use this standard and why is it a global standard, right? What are some benefits of pursuing an ISMS implementation? We will then dive deeper into the standard itself, like how it's structured, covering the 7 core clauses within it. And we'll provide a quick summary in the form of an implementation guide or a roadmap, if you will, to get you started on your ISO journey. And lastly, what does it take to get certified? So, sounds exciting, right? So, just let's get right into it then. Talking about what is this standard. So, the ISO is a standard or a framework, and it relates specifically to information security. Now, it has become the de facto standard for information security around the world. Hundreds of thousands of organizations have been certified to it. It does take a long time to actually implement your ISMS and get certified, but this is what the standard does to you. It improves your processes, it improves security. So it can be basically treated as a basis of comparison for effectively managing your information security, and more specifically, the risks associated with your information security. Now, a little history also over here, tad bit of history. The standard was created by two organizations, the ISO, and that's what it's always called, is the International Organization for Standardization, and the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission, to provide a standard framework for information security management. So this standard is talking about a tad bit of history, right? So this standard was pre-existed by British Security Standard BS 7799, which stems all the way back to the 1990s. So it's been around for a while. It's definitely well established and gone through important revisions. Now, these organizations released the first revision or first set of standards in the year 2005 and have since updated, revised, and the most current version is the 2013 version. One thing to note is this standard was last reviewed in 2019, but 2013 version still remains the current version. Cool. So talking a little bit about what exactly, standard framework, and what does this really do for us or our organizations. So it's an internationally recognized information security standard, as I mentioned on the earlier slide. And like I mentioned before, right, many organizations around the world have been certified to this standard. So it's definitely far reaching and global, and it takes a risk-based approach. So what it means is enabling risk-based decision making for your upper management, senior management, with facts all written down, documented, and it provides a set of requirements to, or a best practice framework basically, to implement, maintain, and improve your ISMS. We'll talk about what is an ISMS in a bit, But yeah, and the structure is basically consists of 7 core clauses, and an Annex A is attached to the standard, which is elaborated and detailed in ISO 27002. But the Annex A just lists out controls and control categories or sections or control objectives, as they call it. But all in all, just think about ISO 27001 as putting systems in place to identify risks and prevent security incidents. Now, one thing to note is that ISO is a non-prescriptive standard. Now, what do I mean by that? Is you or your organization can basically decide if a particular control applies to your org or not. So, in effect, it tells you what you need to do, but not necessarily how you need to do it. So, let me give you one example. Password requirements are not explicitly defined in the standard. So, it will then depend on your organization's risk appetite or like regulations that you need to comply with. So, in terms of who needs ISO, because we're talking about ISO and it's literally everywhere, the standard is so broad that multiple organizations it can be applied to varied organizations of any size, any type, be it any sector or even any country. So, as long as they have a need for information security management system, and they want to improve their processes, documentation, you will see a lot of cloud providers and SaaS providers go for it, majorly because their customers require them to do so. But yeah, so that's an initial introduction to the standard. And now I'll hand it off to Palak to talk about ISMS and ISO 27001.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being an amazing and patient audience. So yeah, let's dive deep into what is actually ISMS. So when we say information security management standard, at the core of it, it's just a set of repeatable processes which consist of a set of security controls that help in protecting the CIA, which is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the assets of any organization. So now, moving on to why we are talking specifically about ISO 27001 ISMS. Okay, the one weird part about this is that I can hear my own voice. So I'm sorry about that if I just juggle for that. So yeah, so the idea of ISMS comes from ISO 27001 itself. This can be used for any framework. So if you're newer to implementing any framework for your organization, how this can help is it can help it can help in establishing the cybersecurity program from the very scratch. So let's dive deep into how we can actually implement that framework. So first of all, before getting started with anything, let's see how the documentation is going to play a role. So we would want to first have a documentation around systems and assets that the organization you would like to protect, right? And you should be able to rationalize or justify your decisions for any external third party. For example, if an external auditor comes in, you should be able to justify why you have made such a choice. I'll give you an example for that. So if you're staying in New York, which is not prone to earthquakes, your BCP night might not be addressing any issues related to earthquakes, right? Whereas on the other hand, if you're staying in California, if your office is based out of California, which is more earthquake prone, you would want to know like your BCP is addressing those concerns or not, even in the first shot. The second is the idea of implementing any framework is to ensure that we have a set of processes that can be repeatable and can be consistent across all the organization. So you would want to make sure that you have enough controls in place to manage the risk to assets, and which ultimately leads to acceptable levels of infosec risk in accordance to your business risk appetite. The third one is, as we are all aware about this thing in our security world, that risk can never be reduced to zero. It can be reduced to an acceptable level, which is acceptable according to the risk appetite of your organization. You might be thinking, what is actually the risk appetite? That will be decided by the senior management of any organization, who will help us in understanding what is the threshold up to which they can accept that risk, be it financial, be it reputational, be it operational. So this is something that the senior leadership team helps us in understanding. Next, what is ISO 27002? Okay, ISO 27002 acts as a reference document, which basically outlines all the sub-controls that you need to implement in order to meet the requirements which are defined in ISO 27001. So basically, it's a detailed guide about how you can actually implement those standards. The good thing about ISO 27001 is, and 27002 is they help you in understanding how these can be implemented, but there is no hard and fast rule about, oh, you should be doing this, otherwise there is no other way to implement that control. But it is a detailed reference for people who are just starting with it. It's a detailed guide to help you and just holding your hand to get to the end. So now I'll pass it to Shefali, who will be talking about why we need ISO 27001.
Yeah, thanks, Palak. So one question that I get asked pretty often is, why do we use standards? Whether you realize it or not, you're already using processes in your organization, and standards are just a way of acknowledging that we do this process quite often. There is an opportunity here to look at how we can make things run more efficiently and effectively. Standards also actually reduce human error and improve quality, because it helps you to understand ultimately how your inputs are becoming your outputs. Or in other words, you can say how your time, cost, and effort translates into your bottom line, right? Of protecting your company assets, company data. So here we have tried to go with some benefits of pursuing an ISO 27001 implementation or certification. Now, do note, to have an effective ISMS, you don't really need to be certified. You can have an effective ISMS by implementing and continuously improving it as well. So yeah, let's go over some benefits real quick. So ISO improves information security. We all know security is pretty complex and has a lot of moving parts, right? There are also varying opinions of how things should be done, how things should be implemented. So ISO does a bit of work for us in that it simplifies security. How? Because it helps build a robust system in place, a robust information security program, and it effectively protects our systems and processes from unauthorized access to sensitive data. It also provides a systematic approach to your risk, right? Because it helps identify weaknesses and vulnerabilities, which then leads to corrective actions for improvement, your treatment plans, as well as informed decisions on security investments. So I think, to me, ISO 27001 definitely sounds like a proven recipe. Um, in terms of governance, what does the standard have to offer us? So by implementing the best practice guidelines and the standard itself, it helps us provide enhanced information security awareness among our employees. You will also be putting in place policies and procedures using due care and due diligence principles. Ultimately, it also increases top management's accountability regarding information security. So yeah, and then in terms of conformity and compliance, actually, so you'll be compliant with this standard, and it also simplifies multiple regulatory frameworks and industry standards, like take for example PCI DSS or HIPAA. You can also have multi-attestation framework, like you can basically build your high trust and SOC 2 on top of your ISMS. So that's how it also helps. So it's a robust framework. Also, it does help with GDPR and privacy requirements. So, yeah, a lot of benefits, as you can see. In terms of marketing, uh, it does lead to sometimes or multiple times, it leads to increased competitive advantage, among your competitors and interested parties, stakeholders. Now, what do they want for you? Or, like, as a customer, they are wanting that you secure your data, you take information security seriously, and that you have basically, you'll get to demonstrate that you have implemented internationally recognized standards to protect your data. So that's important. And in terms of increased business opportunities, uh, you will potentially have reduced cost as a result of almost no data breaches, almost, because there can never be no full security always, right? Also reduces the burden associated with questionnaires, on-site audits by third parties. So all in all, I would say the real benefit of ISO 27001 is that you're going to have an effective information security uh, program that protects the bottom line, essentially protecting your data, which is the most important. um, and another point to note is, ISO 27001 does not equate, do not misunderstand it to equate it being 100% security. But when effectively deployed, it definitely improves an organization's information security and resilience. So that's about the benefits. Now let's move on to the structure and core clauses that Palak and I would be diving into.
Okay, awesome. Let's say that you are very impressed with our presentation on ISO 27001, and tomorrow you go ahead and grab a copy of the standard, and you will see that this is a huge standard, a huge document for 23 pages long. This is scary, right? You shouldn't be scared about that. I was too at the first time. But from a cybersecurity perspective, the important pages that have the most of the content is just about 10 to 12 pages that we really need to understand. So the first part is basically of 11 clauses, which covers from 0 to 10. And the first three are not actual requirements. These are just the introduction, scope, and references and terms and definitions, which will help you in understanding the standard itself. So you don't need to worry about that part. The only part that we should be concerned about is Annex A controls, which are 114, as Shefali has mentioned before. We need to make sure that we have enough understanding to how to actually implement those security controls, because this will help us in, as I mentioned before, this will help us in protecting the CIA of our information and assets there. So moving on to the next slide, are we ready to get down to business? What business we have here is ISO 27001, and Shefali will be walking us through the first few clauses and starting with the context of the organization, which is clause number 4.
Yeah, so the clauses are numbered clause 4 through 10. The first clause that we're going to talk about is the context. So what do we mean by context? It basically involves 3 points here: external and internal environment and issues, your interested parties, and your ISMS scope. So you basically need to understand your organization, its purpose, its context, as in, legal and regulatory requirements, contractual obligations. External issues could take the form of, do you have cyber insurance? Um, are you taking into consideration evolving threats? What does your competitive landscape look like? What are your competitors doing, basically? And your internal issues could include your technology, systems, applications, your finances, your organization structure itself, your leadership. Once you have identified that, then you need to identify your organization's interested parties and stakeholders. Basically, who are we doing this for? Why are we implementing an ISMS? Why do we need it right now? What are our stakeholders' requirements or needs? Once we have the first two bullet points, then we look at scope. you must always document your scope before you start your implementation. So you have a defined boundary, right? Scope is very important as it also determines the cost and risk of implementation, as well as number of audit days. um, so the scope does take into account the previous two bullet points, as well as any third parties or interdependencies that you might have. Then different organizations, uh, as in departments within the organization, that would be included in the scope. And in summary, what are we trying to accomplish and why are the basic, what we get out of the context. And also, what are our business objectives? Because that would tie it back down to the purpose of the organization. The next clause is the clause of leadership. Now, an often overlooked yet very important bonus to ISO is the involvement by upper management, senior management of the company. Why is this particularly important is because ISO is a business driven project and should therefore have the full backing of the upper management team. So you need to ensure that senior management and leadership is on board with the idea of implementing an ISMS, providing you with the relevant access to budget, resource requirements, and then you have your information security objectives well documented. Also, in your policy, your information security policy needs to be appropriate to the purpose of your organization. It needs to also include your objectives that you already defined, a commitment to basically satisfy security requirements, and also commit to a continuous improvement of your ISMS. Again, the objectives and the policies need to be documented as a requirement of the standard. They need to be communicated and be available to employees. So, in summary, this clause basically talks about what is the responsibility, accountability of top management, and what is their role really in governing the entire ISMS. Yeah. And now Palak will talk about the rest few of them clauses.
Okay. Yeah. So clause number 6 talks about planning. As per ISO, risk assessment is at the heart of effective information security management. ISO 27001 gives us a more structured and comprehensive approach to risk. So when I think about risk, the three terms that come to my mind first are risk, threat, and vulnerability. So for those who are just entering the world of security or cybersecurity, I would just give an example to understand this better. So vulnerability is any weakness that can be exploited by an actor. So for example, if you are leaving your doors unlocked at your house, this itself is a vulnerability. Threat is someone who is actually trying to use that particular vulnerability to cause any harm to you or your organization. To my example, if someone is trying to use that open door to come into your house to steal any valuable commodities, that is a threat. Risk is defined as the potential for any loss or damage that can be caused by that particular threat. So here, the risk can be that you are actually losing that valuable commodity, right? So risk is always a joint combination of a threat and a vulnerability. And before going ahead and just thinking about performing the risk assessment, you might want to define the high-level methodologies to include the criteria about how you should be performing the risk assessment and what is the acceptable risk to your organization. As I mentioned before, this is something that the leadership team can help you in understanding. Next, what would you want to do in actually performing that risk assessment? You would want to identify the risk. CSF, which is a common secure framework, is actually a great source which can help you in getting started with what are the generic risks that you might want to look at when you are looking from the scratch for any organization. So you might want to identify the risks which are applicable to your organization. This is a generic way of making you understand how you can get started, but not all the risks which are defined there is applicable to you. You need to understand what is your scope, what is your organization looking for. Then you want to understand who are the risk owners or business owners for those risks. These are the people who will be actually responsible for understanding how the impact is going to be, what is the likelihood. So when you are analyzing those risks, you will want to understand what is the probability of that risk actually happening to your organization, and what is the impact, what is going to happen if that is occurring. Then after evaluation, you might want to prioritize the risk and understand what can be done to reduce or minimize that risk to an acceptable level. For that, you might want to reach out to the business owners to see what can be done to mitigate and to treat those risks. So once these priority levels are identified, you want to determine the controls that can be put in place. The next one is statement of applicability. So what SOA is, it basically contains controls which are applicable to your organization. So when we talk about 114 controls that are defined in Annex A of ISO 27001, there might be some exclusions or inclusions based on your risk, based on your organization or what world you are dealing in, what area you are working in. So for any exclusions, if you want to make any, you should be able to justify that to any external third party. My example would be more to an auditor, from an auditor's perspective. So if they come in and ask you like why this controls is not implemented, you should be able to justify that why this is not applicable to you. The next one is information security objective. This should be defined at a leadership level. You should be able to know what you are trying to achieve from an information security perspective, where you are currently and where you would want to see your organization to be headed. So this is all about clause 6. The next one is clause 7, support. When we are in the field of cybersecurity, we always say that people are our biggest threat surface, be it even phishing, be it anything. So people are the core and the heart of ISMS. When we are talking about resources, so resources is anything that can help you in establishing, implementing, maintaining, improvising, or any framework, right? And the next one is competence. We want to make sure that the people who are involved in maintaining or working on the ISMS are competent enough to basically do this job. So how do we ensure that people integral to managing the risk have the required competence? This can be done through obtaining different certifications or understanding these courses or classes by which you can gain a basic understanding of how you can perform the risk assessment, what you should be taking care of, and how to deal with this when you are talking to business, and how you are actually communicating to the leadership as well. The next one is information security awareness and training. This is about disseminating information about different policies that you might have defined at a high level, the standards that you want to comply by, along with any implications if there is a non-conformity. The next is communication. As Shefali has discussed before, that we need to communicate it to third parties, so which might include internal, which is your leadership team or other teams that you are working with, the external entities. Again, I can give you an example of different auditors that might come in to see what is the progress. So how we need to communicate, what we need to communicate, and who needs to communicate that. This all falls under the category of communication. The next one is documented information. So as I have mentioned a couple of times before, ISO 27001 is a very heavy documentation focused framework. So you want to make sure that whatever documentations that you are creating, updating, and controlling, that is done in a consistent way throughout the organization. Okay, so this covers clause 7. And now we'll move on to clause 8, which is operation. Operational planning and control. So it talks about how we are implementing those policies. Okay, you have defined policies and procedures at a very high level. Great, good to go. Then how we are actually implementing that. So if you are, so one of the clauses is change management. If you are trying to make a change to any existing system or any existing application, how you are going about it. There should be a documented and defined procedure to do that, right? So ISO is, they might want to, if the auditors come in, they might want to see that how you have made this change, what is the supporting documentation for that? If that change goes wrong, how you are going to roll back. So as mentioned before, this is a very heavily documentation focused framework. So make sure when you have actually defined something in your policies and procedures, you are making every effort, and the teams also are making every effort to make that implemented. The next one is gap analysis. Gap analysis is basically assessing where you stand currently and what is your desired position, what is your desired future state. So once that is defined, you can always define a roadmap to reach there. It is not a requirement, but this is obviously something that you would want to look into. So, in summary, how do we plan, implement, and control the processes which are needed to achieve our objectives and risk are being considered? That's what we want to make sure at the bottom line. Information security risk assessment and treatment, I have already talked about before. But if anyone has any questions about those, feel free to drop them in the chat box and we can answer them. Shefali will be talking about clause 9 and 10. And yeah, I'll pass it on to her now.
Awesome. So for clause 9, we have performance evaluation, right? It basically goes over 3 items or bullet points. Are you measuring and monitoring your security metrics? Are you performing internal audits? And are you doing management reviews with your leadership teams? So in terms of measuring and monitoring, analyzing your metrics, you first need to understand what are the metrics that you would include. How there are different ways that you could probably evaluate and analyze these metrics. So how would you be doing them? How often would you be doing them? When? And who does them? Who performs these measurement activities? Who performs the reporting activities to the leadership team? Talking about internal audit. So a key thing to note here is internal audit needs to be performed by auditors who are separate from the team implementing the ISMS. No, they cannot be, the same team, same person. So it needs to be a completely different team. Or usually I see organizations hiring consultants or third parties to perform the internal audit function as well. Think of internal audit as a means to check on your own work and control implementations, and like a kind of preparation for the final examination, if you will. How does it really help is because if you have a robust internal audit program, it will help you get through your external audits because you will be essentially identifying your weaknesses before the external auditors get to it. Um, Lastly is the management review meetings. Is something like you can set up your ISMS committee, which comprises of the core ISMS implementation team, as well as executives from the C-level teams, and you want them to be continually engaged, involved by providing regular reviews and providing updates to them, not only during the certification phase or the first year, but this should be done on an ongoing basis. So this clause talks about how does management ensure and validate the effectiveness of your ISMS, that it's essentially achieving its objectives, what it had stated at the very beginning. How are security metrics evaluated and analyzed, and how are internal audits being performed? And this is the final core clause of the standard, which talks about improvement. So even with a very good ISMS implementation, sometimes things can go wrong, right? So what happens? What if and when they do go wrong? What do we do about it? What is the process we follow to ensure that we learn from those challenges and mistakes? How do we address those identified deficiencies or non-conformities and continuously improve, even though those were identified? So we need a treatment plan or corrective action, right? And once those corrective actions have been implemented, you again really need to review the effectiveness of those corrective actions. So continual improvement is a major requirement of the standard, and this clause, complying with this clause will basically demonstrate to the auditors and show how your ISMS has improved. So, as you mentioned at the very beginning, the structure, along with the clauses of the standard, you have an Annex A, which basically talks about the security control objectives, which are 14 of them, as you can see on this slide. And then you have 114 controls. So, we've just given a brief overview, as all these control objectives touch various aspects of information security. And it's much more detailed in the ISO 27002 standard, which you can basically use as a guide when you go ahead and implement your ISMS. And we have a quick summary on the different steps that you can basically use to build your own cybersecurity program and ISMS, which Palak will be covering now.
Great. I hope you can just go ahead and implement ISO 27001 tomorrow at your organization. So I know it's a long road, but trust us, it's worth it. So this is just a recap of what we discussed. So we should be determining the scope first to make sure that we know that what we are trying to protect and why we are trying to protect that. The next one is understanding your risk. As I said before, not every risk is very generic, and maybe some of them apply to your organization, maybe some of them will not. So make sure that you know what is applicable to your set of data and what's your set of assets. The next point is to determine the best way how you can manage those risks. So if you want to accept a couple of them, maybe that is not that valuable to your organization. Maybe you want to treat them. That is completely and independently your decision. But you should be able to justify that and rationalize that in front of any third party. You should be able to document the SOA, which is Statement of Applicability, which we discussed about before. For those 114 controls that are defined in Annex A, you want to make sure that you know what is included and what can be excluded. Please close any gaps between your current and desired state, because all of us are trying to reach that desired future state in general. Then you should be able to conduct the ISMS internal audit. I think that was one of the questions that was asked in the chats as well, that once we are done with the gap assessment and risk assessment, can we just go ahead and involve the external auditors? I would say that risk assessment and gap assessment is just a part of the entire journey. So, but once you feel comfortable that you have implemented those controls and you are confident enough, please do get the internal team involved, internal audit team involved. Internal audit team will be just like a pre-test, like a mock test before you actually prepare for the exam, actually appear for the exam. So the external certification audit would be an independent third party who will be actually assessing those risks. And yeah, then once you're done with the external audit, then yeah, you can just go ahead and celebrate. You would be certified. And repeat. Yeah, so this is what the roadmaps looks like. And yeah, I hope everyone who is actually trying to get 27001 certified would actually get something out of this presentation. The last one is about how does one get certified. I hope that also helps in the last question that was asked in the chat. So ISO 27001 certificate is often required by high-profile organizations or government agencies. So this by no means actually says that you cannot successfully implement ISO if you do not have that particular certification. So the external third-party audit will be done by actually the auditors coming in on site to look at the controls in place. So the first stage is often performed on site at your location, in which the auditors might want to look at the policies and the processes to determine your readiness for the ISO framework. And this will lead to actually stage 2, in which they will be going in and checking in some of the controls which are defined in the Annex A of ISO 27001 standard. So don't worry, because there might be some gaps which can be identified in your internal audit or your external audit. Before getting certified, you might need to address those gaps. So what I just defined before, like stage 1 and stage 2, this is our initial audit. The next one is our surveillance audit. ISO 27001 certificate is valid for 3 years. So during which you'll be undergoing the surveillance audits, which are required to be completed at least an annual basis. So if they just the auditors would want to see if there are any significant or relevant changes to your scope of your ISMS, or also which you are working on the roadmap that you defined before. So ISO 27001 just want to make sure that there is a continuous progress. So when I say that there might be gaps, you don't need to like worry about it. You just need to make sure that there is a plan in place that you can help in addressing those gaps. The recertification audit is basically when before the expiry of the initial 3-year certification and in the subsequent cycle, full recertification audits will be performed to ensure the continuity of your certification. The scope of this audit would basically depend on the findings that might be coming from the surveillance audit or what is determined in the first stage of the audit as well. So yeah, and remember, an ISO 27000 certificate is valid for 3 years. So you might want to get recertified after that. That concludes all our slides. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box and we'll be happy to answer that.
Yeah.
And thank you for being an amazing audience.
Yeah, thank you so much. We understand that we actually covered a lot of ground. We hope it gave you a bit of context and flavor to ISO 27001. We also wanted to point out that ISO 27001 certification doesn't really mean that a business is 100% secure. There's no 100% secure ever, right? It means that the business, the organization is taking every precaution and putting necessary controls in place to reduce their exposure, risk exposure, to an acceptable level. So that is why don't risk it, cybersecure it. Yeah, and we're open to questions now.
Yeah. Okay, I think there is a question. Thinking of pursuing a career in privacy tech or compliance, such as what you ladies do. I have a degree in IT security. Any suggestions as to what steps to take or certificates to pursue and what entry-level position I should seek? Shefali, do you want to take that or?
Yeah, so I started off my career also as basically as an IT auditor, and the same thing Palak did. So we were initially IT auditors and then got into the security auditor space. I think that's an excellent entry to cybersecurity. In terms of certifications to pursue, we have CISA, Certified Information Security Auditor, Systems Auditor, and then you can also look at CISSP, but I would suggest CISSP after you have some bit of experience, because that's like too broad. You can also start to look at, so you already are in privacy tech. So I'm assuming you might have looked at the CIPPE. So that helps in privacy audits as well. Yeah.
Also, you can look at, since CISA is from ISACA, you can also look at C-Risk, which is similar certificates on similar lines, but more focused on risk. So this is something that you would want to look at when you are implementing ISO 27001 as well. Also, there are so many online certifications that can help you in understanding ISO 27005 framework, which is more risk-focused one. So you might want to get started with that before you deep dive into ISO 27001.
Right. And there are certifications for ISO 27001 lead implementer, lead auditor as well to look at. So those are some good ones. Can we get a copy of the presentation? Sure.
I guess that would be a great question for Kelly. we really cannot answer that question.
Yeah. CDBSE, yeah. Right.
Yes.
Any other questions? How did you find this presentation? Especially because we are first-time presenters as well. Thank you. Yeah, awesome. You can also chat with us, like DM us. We are on Slack also. So
yeah, and you can always feel free to add us on LinkedIn. We love getting connected to new people and would love to know where you are working and how you are implementing security at your organization.
Yeah, so we, for a bit of context, we took it as a challenge last year. And we literally got certified in 7 months from starting out. So this was a first time for us. And yeah, I guess we're the only dating app also to be ISO certified. So that was a huge accomplishment for us. And technically, it's just Palak and me in the GRC team. So we held the fort. Sure, yeah. We did have a good foundation. Yes. Yeah. Um, how many orgs are actually certified? Let me find that link if I can find it.
Oh, just a quick Google search says that not more than 33,000.
That's, I guess, only in the US, but there was a sheet
Yeah.
that went around that even I looked at, and now for some reason I cannot really find it. You never
Okay,
find
does
things when you
anyone
really want them,
else?
right?
What's that?
You never find things when you really want them.
Of course. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to like drop them in the chat box, or you can always find us on LinkedIn. And yeah. Also, we are hiring if anyone wants to join our awesome GRC team with me and Shefali. So feel
Yeah,
free to
we
reach
have quite
out.
a few positions right now. We have application security open, we have infrastructure security open, and the GRC team.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're growing. It's going good. Any other questions?
I think we covered all the questions.
Oh, nice. Thank you, Chelsea. So, Katrina, I can probably DM you once I find that link of the number of organizations actually certified.
Okay.
Mhm. Yeah, my kitty in the background is also meowing.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone who joined this. And yeah, we are super excited to meet you all. I know this is virtual, this is not the ideal thing in the world. But yeah, thank you so much for being patient in the beginning as well. At least for me, I'm so thankful for that. I was not able to join for a long time. So thank you so much for doing that. And yeah, I hope to see you all again.
Yeah, thank
All
you.
the very best. Thank you. Take care. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.